So this image you can see is a BSE backscatter electron image of an experiment that I did during my work, and it's a carbonatite, quenched crystals here, and the sulfide melt. This image, we use this experiment for measuring the sulfur content of a carbonatite. So without any further ado, let's move on to the talk. Yeah, sulfur is an essential ingredient for life, and it fuels metabolism of countless different prokaryotic organisms, which has evolved throughout the history of life on Earth. Protein contains about 3 to 6% of sulfur amino acids, which is used to build and fix DNA, protect cells from damage, and prevent serious diseases. Thus, we can say that sulfur has important uses in a human body. But while speaking geologically about sulfur, when we do a simple Google search about sulfur cycle leads us to the superficial sulfur cycle. On land, sulfur is deposited in 4 major ways: precipitation, fallout from atmosphere, rock weathering, and decomposition of organic matter. Runoff by river supplies sulfur from the surface of the land to the marine ecosystem. The deepest portion of the superficial sulfur cycle in this image is the soil. Soil receives sulfur both from marine ecosystems as well as from terrestrial ecosystem, and decomposes the sulfur back into the atmosphere. The most interesting thing about this superficial sulfur cycle is that sulfur can be present in multiple oxidation states. We can see that at sulfates in the soil and in the marine ecosystem, sulfur is present as S6+, which is the sulfate. A hydrogen sulfide is present where sulfur is as S2- phase, and the atmospheric sulfur dioxide where sulfur is in +4 state. However, sulfur is not only confined on the Earth's surface, it is present in the deep interior as well. The deep Earth sulfur cycle is something that not many people think about generally, but it is actually connected to the superficial sulfur cycle. Sulfur gets incorporated into the marine sediments and altered oceanic crust when they receive sulfur from the rivers. Then the marine ecosystem buries sulfur into the sediments and altered oceanic crust, which goes deep into the mantle during the subduction. At subduction zones, some of the sulfur is released from the subducting slab onto the surrounding mantle, which we also call as the mantle wedge. And this results in melting of the mantle wedge and release of sulfur and other gases, eventually through arc volcanoes. Beyond the subduction zone, some sulfur gets transferred deep into the convecting mantle, where low degrees carbonated melt and relatively higher degree silicate melt has the potential to extract sulfur in various different tectonic settings. This cartoon by Canfield in his figure shows us how exactly deep sulfur cycle is connected to the surface. So sulfide and sulfate are the 2 minerals that gets weathered and goes into the ocean as sulfur. Then ocean buries the sulfur mostly as sulfide and sulfate. And then these minerals get subducted deep into the mantle, and the mantle releases sulfur into the ocean atmosphere system by volcanic outgassing, hydrothermal circulation, and oceanic crustal weathering. As we see that sulfur is one of the major volatile elements with huge redox potential, it plays huge significance in different planet scale processes. One of them is regulating the marine redox condition over geological time scale. Long-term burial of oxidized sulfur over reduced sulfur regulates the marine redox conditions, and it is controlled by the atmospheric oxygen level. This figure plots seawater sulfate in the y-axis and time in the x-axis. In the early Earth, the seawater sulfate concentration was low because the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere was also low. With time, as oxygen level in the atmosphere started to increase, the seawater sulfate also increased to its present value. The oxygenated atmosphere resulted in preferential burial of sulfate minerals over sulfide minerals, leading to controlling of the modern redox condition in the seawater. Sulfur also helps us to determine the redox properties of mantle and mantle-derived magmas. This figure shows us the sulfate over total sulfur on the y-axis and oxygen fugacity in the x-axis. This shows us that sulfate over total sulfur ratio can be used to measure the oxygen fugacity of mantle-derived magmas in different tectonic settings. Mid-ocean ridges are more reduced than ocean island basalts, which are even more reduced than island arc basalts, and sulfate over total sulfur ratio has been used to look into the oxygen fugacity of these magmas. Sulfur-bearing phases also help us to sequester economically important elements during magmagenesis. Elements such as copper, gold, and platinum group elements are sulfide loving, and they tend to get incorporated into the sulfide bearing phase in the deep mantle. The figure on the left shows the partition coefficient of gold with oxygen fugacity, and we see that the values are always greater than 1. It means that it has the tendency to get incorporated into the sulfide phase. And in the figure on the right, we see the bulk partition coefficient. The red and the green lines show us that in presence of a sulfide, these chalcophile elements like copper, chromium, they tend to incorporated into the mantle and not get incorporated in the melt. Thus, we can say that when sulfur as a phase is present, mostly sulfide, these elements will return back and will not be mobilized by melting. However, if sulfide is removed from the source while melting, these elements will be mobilized, and thus it can lead to the formation of economically important ore deposits. Sulfur-bearing phases are an important component in volcanic gases as well. Sulfur dioxide released into the atmosphere during volcanic activity can cause reduction in global temperature. This process is so important that people have thought about injecting sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere to mitigate the ongoing global warming. It's a wild suggestion, but people have given that. So sulfur dioxide released from the volcanoes can cause global reduction in temperature, as we have seen after the eruption at Mount Pinatubo, Philippines in 1991. The figure on the left shows us a volcanic clouds after an eruption. The figure on the right shows us the stratospheric aerosol content, which is color coded. The color blue shows us when there is low aerosol content, and the color red shows us where there is high aerosol content. We see that before the eruption, the aerosol content was low. Just after the eruption in the equatorial region, the aerosol content was really high. However, we see that after 15 months of the eruption, the aerosol content in the stratosphere has globally increased a lot. And even after 2 years of the eruption, the aerosol content in the stratosphere has not gone down to what it was before the eruption. Thus, we can say that sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere can cause global reduction in temperature, as it is seen in Mount Pinatubo eruption. It has caused reduction of 0.6 degrees C after the eruption. So now, as sulfur has huge significances in different planet scale processes, understanding the sulfur cycle in various locations of the Earth becomes critical. So I decided to break down my talk today in 2 different parts. Part 1 of the talk will be mostly in the subduction zone. It will deal with the sulfur cycle of subduction zone and will tell us the story of how oxidized sulfur is relevant in subduction zones. Following that part, we'll go on to talk about sulfur extraction from deeper portions of the convecting mantle, beneath mid-ocean ridges in the oceanic mantle, as well as beneath cratons in the continental mantle. So the first part, the subduction sulfur cycle. The subduction sulfur cycle starts with the input of continental sulfur from rivers to the seawater. Sulfur then gets incorporated into the marine sediments and altered oceanic crust as sulfur-bearing mineral phases. Seawater sulfate gets reduced to pyrite and is buried in the marine sediments. Sulfate minerals are also buried along with it due to the saturation of these sulfate phases like anhydrite and gypsum from the seawater. Hydrothermal alteration of oceanic crustal sulfur to anhydrite and presence of pyrite and pyrrhotite makes sulfur a ubiquitous component in the process that recycles the crustal material from the surface into the deep earth. During the recycling of the crustal material into the deeper mantle, materials from the surface are subducted in the subduction zone, and the subduction zone takes place at convergent margins, where with increasing pressure and temperatures, the subducting slab, which contains sulfur-bearing minerals, they melt. Due to the melting of this, sulfur, water, and carbon dioxide and other volatile elements are released from the subducting slab onto the surrounding mantle, which we also call the mantle wedge. This results in volatile induced melting of the mantle wedge and in eventually releases volcanic eruptions at arc locations. So when we see that arc magmas, we tend to think about contribution from the subducting slab. Arc magmas show evidence of slab contributions. Elevated large iron lithophile elements and negative niobium tantalum anomalies are compared to magmas from other tectonic settings. The figure on the left, we see that large iron lithophile elements like rubidium, barium, thorium, and uranium are higher in arc magmas compared to magmas from other tectonic provinces. The reason behind this is that these elements like rubidium, barium, thorium, and uranium, they are large ion lithophile elements and they are fluid mobile in nature. Thus, when fluids are transferred from the subducting slab onto the mantle wedge, these elements also get transferred along with them. Another evidence is the negative niobium tantalum anomaly. Niobium and tantalum behave exact oppositely to that of the large ion lithophile elements. Rutile is a phase that is saturated in the subducting slab, and niobium and tantalum, they tend to get incorporated into the rutile and will not be transferred from the subducting slab onto the mantle wedge, and this will lead to negative niobium tantalum anomalies in arc magmas. We also know that there is stable isotope study which shows that seawater derived serpentinized sulfate are recycled through arc volcanism. The figure on the right shows exactly that. DMM is depleted morb mantle which has sulfur concentration, pretty low sulfur concentration, and delta 34S of around -1, which is the mantle value. When we look at the delta 34S of serpentinite derived sulfate, they are around +4 with variable sulfur content. And we plot the arc here, and we see that arc lies in between the two, indicating that there is mixing between the mantle and the seawater derived sulfate that is serpentinized through arc volcanism, leading us that there is slab contribution at arc magmas. Now what we are going to look at is the oxygen fugacity of subduction zones. As these multivalent elements like sulfur, carbon, nitrogen, and iron are released from the subducting slab onto the mantle wedge, depending on the valence state of these elements, it can oxidize or reduce the mantle wedge. But there's a debate that remains over the oxygen fugacity of the subarc mantle. Some people think that oxygen fugacity of the subarc mantle is higher than the mid-ocean ridge, whereas some people think that the oxygen fugacity of the subarc mantle is similar to the mid-ocean ridge. In this figure, we can see this orange line is marked as the arc basalt measured range, whereas the mid-ocean ridge is marked as black. And we see that there is significant overlap between the two. And we understand that where this debate is coming from because people might have sampled the place where they overlap. But for the most part of my talk, I'll be focusing on the evidence of high oxygen fugacity of subduction zones. Mount Pinatubo basalt and dacites, these are marked as black bands in this figure of oxygen fugacity with temperature. They plot at around FMQ, which is the oxygen buffer of fayalite, magnetite, and quartz at FMQ plus 2.2. We also see Aeolian arc at around 1.7. And then we have mid-ocean ridges, which is at 0. So we can see that their oxygen fugacity is higher at subduction zone. Other evidence include ferric over total iron of olivine-hosted melt inclusions and ferric iron content of spinels in arc peridotites. The figure on the left plots ferric over total iron in the y-axis and barium over lanthanum ratio in the x-axis. We can see the morb where barium over lanthanum ratio is low as well as ferric over total iron is low. But we also see that the Marianas, which plot as much higher point, and it has higher ferric over total iron and higher barium by lanthanum, indicating higher oxygen fugacity than mid-ocean ridge basalts. The figure on the right shows the y-axis as oxygen fugacity and the x-axis as chrome number, which is an indicator of degree of melting. We see that with similar amount of degree of melting, the arc peridotites, which are plotted as symbols here, are higher oxygen fugacity than the abyssal peridotites, which are the peridotites from mid-ocean ridge. And this also indicates that it might be oxygen fugacity is higher at subduction zones. Now, when we have seen at some of the evidence that can show us high oxygen fugacity of subduction zones, we can expect sulfur to be present in its oxidized state at subduction zones. The first evidence of oxygen fugacity of oxidized sulfur at subduction zones comes from El Chichon, Mexico, in 1982 eruption, when a pumice that erupted during that eruption shows anhydrite as a mineral phase. Here, the phase that is marked N is anhydrite. Anhydrite is a calcium sulfate, and clinopyroxene and anhydrite is present in ground mass in this photomicrograph. After the discovery of oxidized anhydrite at subduction zone, people have tried to look at other subduction zones as well. So to look at other evidence of oxidized sulfur, people have tried to do Zane's analysis of sulfur K alpha peak, which shows the difference in peak positions when it's sulfide and when it's sulfate. we see that pyrrhotite, in which sulfur is present solely as sulfide, there is a peak at around 2470 electron volt. Whereas when the sulfur is present as sulfate in Hauen, the peak shifts to 2482 electron volt. This difference in peak position is a vital tool to differentiate between sulfide and sulfate in various different planet scale samples. People have tried to look into melt inclusions from Mount Pinatubo, Philippines, and basalts from Oregon, and they have seen that it coincides with the peak of sulfate, indicating that oxidized sulfur might indeed be present at subduction zones. Other lines of evidence include electron microprobe analysis of sulfur K alpha peak. Here also, similar to a Zenz analysis, electron microprobe analysis can also show a difference in peak positions between sulfide and sulfate. This has been quantified by previous scientists to quantify the percent of sulfate in the samples. And we see that at Aeolian volcanic arc, the samples lie from various degrees from 0 to almost nearly 100% sulfate, indicating that there is some evidence of oxidized sulfur at subduction zones. As we see that oxidized form of sulfur might be present in the mantle wedge, the contribution of this sulfate is generally thought to be coming from the subducting slab. So the subducting slab contributes most of its sulfate into the mantle wedge. However, water is the main volatile that is being fluxed from the subducting slab onto the mantle wedge. Sulfur species can get transferred along with this water, and sulfate might be present amongst the sulfur species. We know the effect of water on the liquidus of basalt in the which is the primary mantle wedge magma, but the combined effect of sulfate and water is not known to us. The figure on the right shows the olivine liquidus temperature on the y-axis and water content in the x-axis. This figure shows that with increasing water content, the liquidus of an olivine reduces to nearly like 200 degrees C or 100 degrees C, depending on the water content in the melt. So to better understand the subduction zone sulfur cycle and redox, we are going to look at the liquidus behavior of sulfate and water combined in a basalt. And we are also going to look at sulfur carrying capacity of a mantle wedge magma in presence of sulfate, which is called sulfur concentration at anhydrite saturation. Before delving deep into this, I want to clear out what SCAS and what SCSS is. SCAS is sulfur content at anhydrite saturation. If we look into the figure on the left, it's from one of my experiments. Glass, which is the melt, has anhydrite as a phase in it. When this kind of situation arises, this is called SCAS. The maximum amount of sulfur a melt can carry if anhydrite is present as a phase is known as sulfur content at anhydrite saturation, or SCAS. However, just the opposite thing happens when sulfide is saturated. The figure on the right shows a melt in which sulfide is present as a phase. So the maximum amount of sulfur this melt can carry in presence of a sulfide will be called sulfur content at anhydrite sulfide saturation, or SCSS. So why are we going to look at SCAS? There is 10 times increase in sulfur content when the saturation changes from sulfide to sulfate. Looking at these figures, the x-axis is oxygen fugacity and the y-axis is sulfur in silicate melt. We see when the oxygen fugacity is low, sulfur content is lower. With increasing oxygen fugacity, as the speciation changes from sulfide to sulfate, the sulfur carrying capacity increases tremendously, nearly 10 times. Thus, if anhydrite is present as a phase, the melt can carry more sulfide in it. Previously, there has been only 3 SCAS model. Pretty recently, Lee and Ripley 2009, Becker and Moretti 2011, and Masota and Kepler 2015 tried to look at SCAS modeling. Though few in number and pretty recent, they are only modeled for limited pressure range from 0.1 GPa to 1 GPa, and they are mainly done for felsic melts. So models at higher pressures and mafic compositions are not present. And to look into those, we have carried out sulfur carrying capacity of mantle wedge magma in presence of sulfate, and we did some experiments in piston cylinder. The pressures of these experiments are 0.5 to 3 GPa. The temperatures are 1050 to 1325 degrees C. These experiments were done in a gold palladium capsule, and hydrous basalt, around 4 wet% water, is chosen as the starting mix because it is the primary mantle wedge magma, and added with variable amount of anhydrite to vary the sulfur content in them. After these experiments are done, they are polished, they're cut open, they're polished, and then taken to electron microprobe to look into the mineral and melt phases, to measure the sulfur content, and also to determine the SK alpha peak. So first I'm going to show you how we do experiments. So piston cylinder is this blue device here. This device helps us to carry out the high pressure, high temperature experiments. As the image shown on the left, this pressure has two pistons, one here and one here, that applies pressure from both ends into the assembly that is shown in this schematic diagram. In the middle of this assembly, we place the gold palladium capsule, inside which we have our starting mix. Barium carbonate that is placed on side is the pressure medium which absorbs the pressure from the pistons and then supplies onto the sample. This graphite furnace acts as heater, and MgO is kept here as spacers to fill up the gaps. Current is passed through this whole assembly, thus increasing the temperature, and this temperature is measured using a thermocouple. Once these experiments are done, we cut open and polish them. After polishing, we see various different phases. Most of these experiments, like all of these experiments, has melt in them, which is the primary goal of our experiments, to measure the sulfur content in the melt. Whenever there is presence of anhydrite, like this, then this, and also here, these experiments will be viewed as SCAS experiments. Along with this, we also saw magnetite, clinopyroxene, and garnet. To make sure that all the sulfur that is present in this glass is sulfate, we measure sulfur K alpha peak of the glasses from the experimental runs and compare them with reference material using electron microprobe. Because there is a difference in peak positions of sulfate and sulfide standards, the sulfate standard in this case is anhydrite, which is the dotted line, and the sulfide standard is the solid black line, which is phallerite in this case. We see that when we plot the experimental glasses, they lie very close to the anhydrite standard, and we can say that sulfur in our glasses are mostly sulfate. To make sure, we also measured sulfur K alpha peak of these glasses in experimental runs using S-Gens, and we see that all the sulfur that is present in the experiment are as sulfate, because we see a peak at around 2482 electron volt, which coincides with the sulfate peak. Now, once we are convinced that the experiments has sulfate in them, we'll try to look at what effect sulfate combined with water have on the liquidus of a basalt. So liquidus is a line at fixed pressure on a temperature composition diagram, above which all the phases exist only as a liquid state. In this figure, this line marks the liquidus. Above this liquidus, all is liquid. Presence of volatiles like water can depress the liquidus. So what happens is that when volatiles are present, the liquidus temperature goes down, increasing the stability field of the liquid. So if in a basalt, the basaltic liquidus goes down, what happens is that the stability field of basalt increases. In our experiments, without sulfur, a hydrous basalt liquidus is between 1300 and 1325 degrees C. It's seen in this figure. This figure shows different phases in our experiments. This black triangle is the glass, and the colored squares are different minerals. We see that in this experiment at 1325 degrees C, we only had the glass and no sulfur. It's a hydrous basalt, and it's only glass, no sulfur. But at 1300 degrees C, we see clinopyroxene, which is the liquidus phase, has arrived. With sulfur, the liquidus is between 1275 and 1300 degrees C. When we add some sulfate in it, we see that the liquidus has depressed and it has gone down by 25 to 50 degrees C between 1275 and 1300 degrees C. And here as well, clinopyroxene is the liquidus phase. The drop in liquidus of a hydrous basalt with sulfate content can be denoted by this power law here, and presence of sulfate in a hydrous basalt thus increases the stability field of a basaltic liquid as it decreases the liquidus temperature by 25 to 50 degrees C. Sulfur is present as a sulfate anionic group in sulfur when it is S6+. Given clinopyroxene is the liquidus phase, we can assume that sulfate anionic group bonds with calcium 2+, which reduces the stability field of clinopyroxene. And thus clinopyroxene is the liquidus phase instead of olivine, which is the liquidus phase in absence of a sulfate. Once we show that sulfate does cause liquidus depression a bit more along with water in a basalt, we try to look at the SCAS experiments and look at the SCAS values measured using electron microprobe. When we see how SCAS behaves with pressure and temperature, we see that with increasing temperature, SCAS increases. However, with pressure, SCAS has not much effect. When we compare SCAS with melt composition, we see that with increasing silica content, SCAS decreases. With calcium oxide content, SCAS first decreases to a minimum at around 2 weight% and then starts to increase, and it then increases exponentially. Now, when we use our new experiments to plot in old SCAS models from 3 previous studies, we see that the new experiments cannot be answered by the old models. Hence, we need a new SCAS parameterization. As we have seen before that SCAS is a function of temperature and melt composition, we have used the previous experiments as well as experiments from our study, and we show that a new model is being created which better tries to encompass all the experiments that has been previously done. It includes a pressure range of 0.1 to 3 GPa and a temperature of 700 to 1325 degrees C, and includes more mafic experiments that we have done. With our brand new parameterization, we are going to look at whether the speciation in the mantle wedge is sulfide or sulfate. This is particularly interesting because when we look at this plot, we have sulfur in the silicate melt in the y-axis and the extent of melting in the x-axis. This plot helps us to understand which sulfur species can be dominant during mantle wedge melting. The colored lines are different sulfur content initially present in the mantle wedge. If anhydrite is present as a phase in the mantle wedge, the melt sulfur content will be capped at the value of SCAS, which is shown by this black line. This plot shows us that if anhydrite is present as a phase in the mantle wedge, it will get exhausted before 10% of melting. But as at arcs, the extent of melting is much higher than 10%, we will say that anhydrite as a phase is unlikely to be stable in the mantle wedge. However, when sulfur is present as sulfide, the melt sulfur content will be capped at SCSS, and the sulfide phase can thus be stable to higher degrees of melting because SCSS is lesser than SCAS. After exhaustion of these sulfur-bearing phases, sulfur behaves as a perfectly incompatible element and its concentration decreases with increasing melting degree. However, the main finding from this figure is that at higher melting degrees, which is generally relevant at arcs like greater than 20% melting, sulfur content in the mantle wedge will be similar, irrespective of whether the mantle wedge stored the initial sulfur as sulfide or sulfate. Once we have made sure about that, the next thing we will test is which species of sulfur is actually present at different arcs. We'll look at melt inclusions from different arcs around the world. This plot shows SCSS in the y-axis and sulfur from melt inclusions in the x-axis. The 1:1 line suggests that SCSS is equal to the sulfur content from the melt inclusions. The arcs that are lying on the 1:1 line and to the left of the 1:1 line has sulfur in the melt inclusion that can be explained by the presence of sulfide. However, the arcs which lie towards the right of the 1:1 line, the melt inclusion sulfur content is higher than what we can describe by presence of sulfide. Thus, we speculate that at these arcs, sulfate can play an important sulfur species. To finally see whether sulfate can be present in some of these arcs, this plot shows us the sulfur content of different arcs in the y-axis and arranged in increasing degree of melting are the different arcs in the x-axis. The orange bars are the sulfur content in presence of a sulfate species. The blue bars are the sulfur content of the melt inclusions, and the black line is the SCSS. The gray shaded bands are the arcs which lies to the right of the 1:1 line in the previous figure. We can see that most of the arcs that lies to the right of the 1:1 line on the previous figure, their sulfur content of the melt inclusions can be described by sulfate as a species. Why we say so? Because the orange bands and the blue bands within error, they match with each other. However, at arcs like Alaska and Costa Rica, the melt inclusion sulfur content is so high that even sulfur as sulfate species cannot explain this value. We argue that sulfate undersaturated magma that we have previously shown in arcs like this, during its ascent beneath the arc volcanoes, can assimilate sulfur from the crust, leading to the high sulfur content that we see in the melt inclusions. So when we look at the new findings from our experiments and we try to understand the subduction zone sulfur cycle and redox, we can say that with temperature and silica content, SCAS increases. As CO increases, SCAS first decreases and then starts to increase. Basalt in the mantle wedge will extract similar amount of sulfur irrespective of whether the initial storage of sulfur is as sulfide or anhydrite. Sulfate does play an important role at some arcs, and we say that anhydrite undersaturated magmas can assimilate sulfur from the crust during its ascent beneath arc volcanoes. Now it's the time for moving to the second part of the talk. For the second part of the talk, I'll focus beyond the subduction zones. Beyond the subduction zones, there's post-dehydration and partial melting. The residual slab, along with sulfur-bearing minerals, subducts even deeper into the convecting mantle. While going deeper, it gets stretched, thinned, and crustal sulfur and other volatiles gets incorporated deep into the convecting mantle. It has been speculated that 120 gigamoles of sulfur per year gets past the subduction zone into the convecting mantle. The deeper mantle has vast portions affected by carbon dioxide and water-induced melting, which is speculated to be happening in presence of a sulfur-bearing species. This happens both beneath mid-ocean ridges in an oceanic mantle and beneath cratons in continental lithospheric mantle. These parts of the mantle show presence of very low-degree carbonated silicate melts like carbonatites, and these melts has the potential to extract sulfur from the deep mantle. This schematic diagram on the left shows a continental mantle beneath the craton and which is affected by low-degree carbonated melts, and this melting occurs in presence of sulfide. The plot on the right shows us the pressure and depth in its y-axis and oxygen fugacity in the x-axis. We also see eclogitic and peridotitic xenoliths from cratons which are plotted in this oxygen fugacity and pressure and depth field. This plot marks the diamond to graphite transition, which is here. It also marks the transition from elemental carbon to carbonated melt, which is demarcated as EMOG or EMOD. This plot also shows the sulfide to sulfate transition, which is marked as SST. The sulfur species on the left of this line is sulfide, while the sulfur species on the right of this line is anhydrite or sulfate. The blue shaded region in this plot shows us the region in which carbonated melts are stable in the mantle, along with sulfide as the stable sulfur bearing phase. And we see that bulk of the mantle xenoliths coming from cratons are which lies in the shaded region, and we think that these xenoliths and these mantle bearing peridotites might have experienced carbonated melting in presence of a sulfide. Not only in the lithospheric mantle, beneath mid-ocean ridges in the oceanic mantle, the carbonated peridotite solidus is encountered at around 300 kilometers depth. When the carbonated peridotite solidus is crossed, we get very low degrees of carbonated melts, and this low degree carbonated melt has the potential to extract some sulfur from the oceanic mantle if the melting takes place in presence of a sulfide phase before volatile free melting in the mid-ocean ridge begins. So to look at the behavior of sulfur during carbonated melting, and also to look at how much amount of sulfur can be extracted by these carbonated melts, we measure sulfur concentration at sulfide saturation of carbonatites and carbonated silicate melts. In this pressure temperature plot, we show the experimental pressure temperature range of our experiments. The pressure range is from 2.5 to 6 GPa, and the temperature range is from 1300 to 1600 degrees C. And we see that in these experiments, the carbonated kind of melts are very much stable, as we see that there is a different percentage of carbon dioxide that is present in this kind of pressure temperature condition. When we look at the texture of our experiments, we see that these carbonatites are quenched as a quenched melt in them. There is sulfide blobs, which shows us that sulfide is present, and then there are silicates in them as well. This quenched melt with submicron sulfide droplets are assumed to be sulfur that is dissolved in the carbonatite just before quenching, and when quenched, they get exhaled and form these droplets that are submicron in size. When we look at how SCSS varies with silica content, we see that SCSS increases with silica content. And when we compare SCSS with nickel content in the sulfide, we see that SCSS decreases with the nickel content in sulfide. With pressure, SCSS is invariant, and with temperature, SCSS increases with increasing temperature. Now we want to see a whole continuum of carbonatite to a basalt, and when we see the carbonatite to a basalt with SiO2, we see that SCSS first increases to a maximum and then starts to decrease when carbon dioxide gets removed from the system. And with FeO, we see that first it starts to decrease, reaches to a minimum at around 5 weight% FeO, and then starts to increase. When we use our new experiments in old SCSS models, we see that some of the experiments which has very low CO2 content, those can be described pretty good by the old models. However, as the SiO2 goes down and carbon dioxide starts to increase, this falls way off the line, and new experiments are not being able to be answered by the old models. Thus, likewise, what we do is that we see that SCSS is a function of temperature, melt composition, and nickel content in sulfide. And we use previous experiments and our experiments to plot a new parameterize a new model that can take into account all the different variables that we have thought of. The silica content of these modeled experiments from like 7 to 50 weight%. The temperature is from 1150 to 1800 degrees C, and the pressure is from 1 bar to 10.5 GPa. Thus, it encompasses a huge range of pressure, temperature, and melt composition, and we modeled a larger range of variables. Now what we are going to do is that using our brand new parameterization, we'd calculate the SCSS in carbonated melts, and we try to look at how much sulfur can be extracted beneath mid-ocean ridges by these carbonated melts before volatile free melting begins at 2 GPa. The figure on the left shows pressure or depth with SCSS. We see that as the melt evolves from a carbonatite to a carbonated silicate melt, the SCSS starts to increase due to the change in the silica content. It reaches to a maximum, after which it starts to decrease. And during this process, 8 to 15% of sulfur can be extracted by these carbonate bearing melts, reducing the availability of sulfur during mid-ocean ridge melting. When we look at continental mantle, we see that this figure shows us the behavior of sulfur during carbonate melt present melting at continental mantle. This plot shows SCSS of carbonated melt along two conductive geotherms of 40 milliwatt per meter square and 50 milliwatt per meter square. The deeper part of the geotherm, which is this red and this green, the SCSS is higher. Whereas when we go to shallower depths, the carbonated silicate melt changes to a carbonatite and the SCSS is lower. This change in SCSS from deeper depths to shallower depths can release up to 3 weight% sulfur into the surrounding as monosulfide solid solution into the continental mantle. This sulfur release can sometimes help us understand the sulfide metasomatism that is so commonly seen in many continental mantle xenoliths. It can also answer the presence of some sulfide inclusions in diamonds from this kind of continental mantle. In this plot, we are going to look at kimberlites, which are thought to be carbonate bearing carbonated silicate melts. In this plot, the sulfur content is shown in y-axis and silica in x-axis. The sulfur measurements from natural kimberlites like Kimberley, Udaknaya, and Monastery are shown in green, yellow, and pink circles. The dark bands are the SCSS that is expected in these kimberlites if melting occurs within a range of 3 to 7 GPa and temperature of 1300 to 1600 degrees C. When we see that the SCSS model matches with the natural sulfur concentrations of the kimberlites, we can say that these rocks, like these kimberlites, might have been formed by CO2-induced melting in the presence of a sulfide phase. Thus, the major takeaway from these studies is that SCSS increases from carbonatite to a basalt and then further decrease with increase in silica content. 8 to 15% depletion of sulfur beneath mid-ocean ridges by carbonated melts in oceanic mantle. In continental mantle, deep kimberlitic melt evolves to a carbonatitic type of a melt and can enrich the surrounding mantle in sulfur, resulting in sulfide metasomatism commonly seen in the mantle xenoliths. Kimberlites could possibly derive from melting of sulfide saturated mantle in presence of carbon dioxide. Now, to put together both the part of my talk, the major takeaways are: in subduction zone in the mantle wedge, similar amount of sulfur is expected to be extracted irrespective of whether the mantle wedge stores the initial sulfur as sulfide or sulfate. Beneath mid-ocean ridges in the oceanic mantle, 8 to 15% of the sulfur can be extracted by low-degree carbonated melts. And beneath cratons in the continental mantle, kimberlites are thought to be formed in the presence of sulfide phase, and it's a carbonate-induced melting. These are the papers that have been already published that I was talking the whole thing about today. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Rajdeep Dasgupta, who was my advisor at Rice University during my PhD, Kyusei, who was the lab manager of Rice University, and he taught me to do most of my experiments, and Gabby, who was the microprobe manager at Rice University and helped me with all the analysis that I have done. And with this, I'll rest my case. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Proteek, for the talk. And now is the time for a question from the audience. And now, before you ask a question, please let us know your name and your institution. Okay, let me first read a question from the chat. From Arkayuti, I think from IIT Bombay. And what is the mutual relationship between the magma oxygen fugacity control on the liquidus or the stability phases with those of the sulfates?
So what I think that he's trying to ask is the mutual relationship between magma oxygen fugacity control on the liquidus and the stability of phases with those of sulfates. Okay, so I think like, so this is a matter of research because how oxygen fugacity control the liquidus, I don't think we probably know it well, because I think sulfate is the only sulfur species that people have tried to look at. Sulfide is not yet being looked at. But with the phases with sulfate, I think what we saw in our experiments is that being sulfate is present and it is sulfate, SO4 2-, which is the anionic form, and it tends to get bond with calcium content, and so Ca2+, and when we form anhydrite, and thus clinoperoxene is the stable phase instead of olivine. So olivine is generally the phase that we see during the liquidus phase, but in these cases, in presence of sulfate, we see clinoperoxene. But I think the maximum magma oxygen fugacity control and liquidus, I think there is not enough study, or at least I don't know of, and I might need to look into those. But yeah, there might be some, but I don't think there has been enough study to say that yet. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think we jumped through the second question in that chat. Okay.
Yeah, I see.
Just directly look at the third one. For the arc, is there any effect on the biosulfide species on the stability and transportation of elements?
Bicarbonate is something that sometimes have been seen at the arcs, but bisulfate and bisulfide, I don't think those are very, I don't think those kind of phases are stable at arc conditions. Like I don't think in any terrestrial conditions, except very superficial maybe, but in deep earth condition, I don't think bisulfides are seen. But bicarbonate species, I think there has been reports of those, and from the arcs, is there any effect on the bicarbonate stability and transportation of elements? I think it will depend, like if bicarbonate can bond, they can bond with calcium and other species. And no, I don't think they will have much effect on the transportation of these major elements like calcium. If they have some effect on rare earth or trace elements, I'm exactly not sure about that.
Okay, so next question is from Huiming Bao from Louisiana. So Huiming, please go ahead.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for organizing this very interesting talk. Proteek, you did a lot of great things in your PhD thesis. I'm impressed.
Thank you.
I'm from LSU and your neighborhood. You know, I never thought of this subduction zone sulfate thing. I always think that most of the subduct stuff should be sulfide because they're going to be reduced. But now I think that probably in ocean crust, if you have a recycling going on, the sulfate that gets into the a deeper part of the crust will be fixated by calcium as a anhydride, right? So
yeah,
maybe the
calcium is
step that
abundant.
is it true that the person you signed the paper 2018, Bernard, or I probably wrong.
Yeah, Antoine Bernard. Yeah.
Bernard, is he advocated the source of the sulfate is actually anhydride in the crust, in the oceanic crust?
I think like I have read papers about where drillings has been done on the oceanic crust, and anhydrite, yes, it is a common phase in the oceanic crust because the hydrothermal alteration changes. But the main question is when the subduction is taking place, whether this anhydrite can be retained to deeper depths where they can release the sulfate from the slab onto the mantle wedge. That is, I think, still an active research area.
Okay.
But people have seen sulfate in arc magmas, so I don't know, they might be present there, they might not be, but yeah.
Okay, if that's the case, let me just say and propose another question. So back in Archean, if you have, you know, the eruption, if the oxygen fugacity is lower enough, then you're not going to have a sulfate in it.
No.
But, yeah, but what if, so do you think that there's no hope or there's no case to have a volcanic eruption that has a sulfate like Altitron, the case that back in the Proterozoic as well, because the Proterozoic ocean sulfate is also extremely low.
Yeah, so what I'm going to say is that there is a paper by, you know, sorry, I forgot the name, Stolper, not Ed Stolper, Dan Stolper, his son. So Dan Stolper and Claire Buchholz from, I think they have a paper in PNAS. They say that actually what you say is right. So we will not expect anything along the Proterozoic. So they show that with time, after the great oxygenation event, the amount of sulfur dioxide that is released from the volcanic eruptions at arcs has increased tremendously after the eruption, so after the great oxygenation event. And thus, what you say is exactly correct. Like we might not expect that kind of eruptions back in the Proterozoic or in the Archean with high sulfur dioxide.
So that means that your magma oxygen fugacity is actually sensitive to the sulfate concentration. That seems to be not right either. I always thought that the oxygen fugacity of a magma will be so much buffered by existing, you know, composition, not this little sulfate in the crust.
The thing is that a little sulfate in the crust might not do that, but what we are saying is that only at arcs, this might be a case. I'm not sure about other tectonic settings. The arcs is special because I think that sulfur, as it can be transferred from the slab onto the mantle wedge, and also sulfur concentrations at arcs are generally a bit higher. And then we see that, what we are, sorry, I forgot. Sorry. Yeah, and we can see that sulfur concentrations, and it has a high redox potential, right? Like so 1 sulfur, so 8 sulfur can, it's a huge redox potential to change the redox of iron as well. So I don't think at other oxygen or other tectonic settings it is relevant, but at arcs it might be. I think arcs,
that makes sense. Okay, so what are you doing now at the University of California Riverside? I don't think they have a high temperature people there.
So there is only Mary Jo Browns, who is a high temperature. She has got just got hired like back in 2017. So I am working with her and looking at Martian rocks and sulfur concentrations in Martian rocks and all that.
Oh, that would be interesting too.
From Earth to Mars.
So you think of Mars? So is it your hypothesis that the Mars was a natural born sulfate rich in its magma?
I have no idea about Mars. I have just started working on it.
I really want to know. Maybe they were just naturally born rich.
I also want to know.
Huh? No?
It's rich in iron, it's rich in sulfur, but I would expect mostly to be sulfide, right? There, it's much more reduced than what Earth is. So mostly sulfide.
So you actually think it's still predominantly sulfide?
Okay. That will just be Earth is predominantly sulfide, but that is going to be sulfide. Yeah, thanks, Mimi.
Thank you.
I think
thank you.
One more question in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah,
There's
well,
one
another
more
question from the
Yeah.
Proteek Chowdhury, undergraduate student from Georgia University. It seems anhydrite only exists near subduction zones. So why is it present or significant under other environments?
So the main reason I think why anhydrite is not so significant in other tectonic settings is because I think anhydrite is mostly formed as an alteration product of hydrothermal alteration. So when water reacts with calcium and sulfate in the seawater, so seawater sulfate is very important while forming anhydrite. And the first thing that forms is gypsum, which is CaSO4, the 2H2O. And after it starts subducting, this water of crystallization, .2H2O, gets removed, and then anhydrite is formed. So I think for anhydrite to form, hydrothermal alteration is one of the most important things. That's why I think it's mostly seen near subduction zones at oxygen, where their ocean crust gets hydrothermally altered.
Okay, so okay, so
yeah, I think
another
there's one more
question.
question. Sorry,
Yeah, another question. Deng Cheng from Institute of Geology and Geophysics, Chinese Academy of Sciences. It says, thanks for your excellent talk. And if the arc mantle wedge have higher oxygen fugacity compared to the morb mantle source, so why does the primitive arc magmas of the morb share similar copper contents?
So yeah, I think this is a very common question. I get a lot this question, why there is similar copper content. So similar copper content, I think, can be coming from two different places. So first, we are exactly not sure what the source of the mantle wedge melting is. So the source of the morb and the source of the mantle wedge that melts might not be similar to begin with. So what I think is that if we look at depleted morb mantle, like if a mantle has been depleted of the, has already morb mantle, mid-ocean ridge melting has taken place, then I think the depleted morb mantle will have lesser copper to begin with during mantle wedge melting. That is one thing that I have thought of. There are oxygen fugacities is not always, I don't think it's always related to copper. And also copper might not be transferred from the subducting slab onto the mantle wedge. We don't know how copper behaves during melting of the subducting slab. So so copper is always low in the mid-ocean ridges because sulfide is present as a phase. And even in mid-ocean ridges, in mantle wedge, sulfide can be present as a phase there as well. So copper will be sequestered by the sulfide. So I think this can be an important thing that we want to look at when we look into other places. But yeah, copper contents might be, I don't think it's a very good way to understand by using only copper. So I think we might try to look at other elements as well. Yeah.
So for example, what are the other elements?
So I think we can look at vanadium, we can look at molybdenum. Those are also, but copper, I think copper is also, we don't know exactly how much copper is transferred from the slab onto the mantle wedge. And what I really think that it can be a case that the source of the mantle wedge melt and the mid-ocean ridge melts are different in copper content. That can be one reason that shows that maybe the source of mantle wedge has lesser copper. So when it melts, we have similar amount of copper.
Okay. Do we have more questions from the audience? Okay. I think that's great. So with that, let's end our seminar today. And thank you very much again, Proteek, for giving the talk. And thanks everybody
Johnny, for inviting me. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. Have a good day. Have a good evening to you.
Yeah. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.